So if I'm going to tell you about my career, I actually have to start at the very beginning of coming out. And the first piece of that coming out story started here in New York City when I came to see Angels in America, which Tony Kushner, the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, wrote. And I really related to one of the characters in that play, Joe the Mormon, who was played by a guy named David Marshall Grant. And I was a senior in boarding school in Virginia at the time, and watching that play in that theater made me realize that I was going to be Joe the Mormon. I was going to be straight and white picket fence and do all the right things to conform to society. And in that theater, I came out to myself, and I realized I couldn't do that to myself. And for anyone who's had to come out to themselves, they know that that can be a very traumatic experience, because everything that you built around yourself and what you were going to be and who you were going to be in that moment goes away. And you have to do that rebuilding of who you actually really are. And you later realize that you're actually the exact same person with just more information, but in that moment it can be very traumatic. And so I went back to boarding school and I wrote David Marshall Grant a letter. And I sent it to the Walter Carr Theater on West 44th Street. And believe it or not, he wrote me back. And over my 4 years at Duke, he wrote me a letter every year, and when I moved to New York City, he took me to dinner. And I share that because that was one of the first formative experiences of understanding the LGBT community, support, sponsors, and that allowed me to be myself and to come out to my fraternity brothers, to my family, and ultimately when I came to Wall Street, I actually was out to my colleagues. And unfortunately, the first bank that I started at in the late 90s, my boss was homophobic and called the guy beside me a faggot my second week. And so I immediately went back in the closet and did what anyone else in a homophobic environment does. I looked for a new job. And the second investment bank that I started at was called DeSilva & Phillips, and I was out in my interview and I said, look, I'm gay and you need to know that. And the partners said, that's totally fine, of course, why wouldn't that be okay? Which was a learning for me as well, because I thought I had to wear my LGBT status on my sleeve because I'd been discriminated against. And what that also allowed me to do was actually connect my LGBT status to business opportunity. And those senior leaders connected me to CEOs, and I was able to win business for the firm by being out. And that was a new experience for me. And so in 2001, I switched sides of the world and went into private banking at Merrill Lynch and had to build a business and had to bring in $1 million a month of new assets. And if after 8 months I didn't have $8 million under management, I was fired. I was 26 or 25 and a half. And I thought, how could I do this? And I looked around and there was no one in the financial services industry at that time who was focusing on the LGBT market opportunity. And I thought, well, there are 1,049 rights at a federal level that gay couples don't receive because they can't get legal marriage recognition. Most of those rights have to do with financial services, estate taxes, titling, asset transfer, investing. And I thought, well, why couldn't we as a financial services institution actually create a niche to serve that market? And so I basically set about building that. And after the first 12 months, I brought in $100 million. And after the first 4 years, I brought in $1.4 billion. Half of it was LGBT nonprofit organizations like HRC, Lambda Legal, et cetera. And we built and managed their endowments, their planned giving programs. And then the other half was domestic partner couples all over the country. And what that taught me was that I could drive LGBT business success by actually engaging in the community. Because along the way, I got Merrill Lynch, an old conservative Catholic command and control organization, to actually support the LGBT community, sponsoring organizations, giving away money, supporting what I was doing, even changing their non-discrimination policies and adding domestic partner benefits, et cetera. All of that was driven because they knew it was good for the bottom line. And so I sort of took that learning when I left Merrill and I went to Credit Suisse and I led diversity and inclusion for them in the Americas in that same framework. And in 2010, interestingly, they had a change in management and I was laid off. I was asked to leave. And I was given a severance check and shown the door, despite the fact that we had achieved all of our goals, which was also an interesting career inflection for me, because for anyone who's been fired, especially for no cause, you know, that's a moment when you have to sort of adjust yourself and say, how am I going to get past this? And I was sitting on my sofa with a severance check and a martini, and I thought, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And I went back to the idea that LGBT inclusion was a business driver. And I looked around and I said, there's nothing that convenes that power of the LGBT community. And I looked at Davos, the World Economic Forum, and I thought, could I create that for the LGBT community? And so I used my severance check to self-fund the first summit. And we had 6 firms, as I mentioned before. And with those 6 firms from there, we launched Out Leadership. And so we now, as I mentioned, have initiatives across 5 continents. And I've built 7 initiatives. So Out on the Street was the first. I then launched Out in Law, which focused on the legal community. And if you could picture a Venn diagram of connection between the senior partners of the law firms and their clients, the general counsel of the banks, that's how I wanted to convene that conversation. I didn't want it to be the right thing to do. I wanted it to be the right thing to do for their business. Along the way, the business talent equality framework that we've built with Out Leadership has remained the same. So in the talent pillar, we have 3 initiatives we've built. One is called Out Next, which is focused on emerging LGBT leaders. It's the first now global LGBT emerging leaders program anywhere. We've now built out Women, which singularly focuses on the senior LGBT women's community and connecting them. Because what we've learned is that senior LGBT women don't feel at home in the LGBT networks because it's primarily run by men. And they don't feel at home in the women's networks because they don't talk about LGBT issues. So we sort of created this community, this ecosystem of women globally to serve that need. And then the final talent initiative is called Quorum. And the idea of Quorum is that we looked around in the board space and realized that there was only one company in the Fortune 500 that included LGBT people in the definition of board diversity. And so we set about to change that both from a public policy perspective as well as creating the first ever database of LGBT potential corporate directors. And then in the equality framework, we've been able to leverage this ecosystem globally of all of these different leaders to push back for LGBT equality, whether it's getting companies to sign on to the amicus brief for marriage equality in the United States, or getting companies to actually help quantify the cost of a plebiscite in Australia around marriage equality, or getting companies to speak out against anti-LGBT violence in one of the 78 countries where it's still illegal to be gay. So as we've grown out leadership, I'm very excited about where we're going in the future because it actually does, I think, lend itself to continuing to grow.